evening and welcome. This is a public hearing of the Plan Commission of the City of Evanston. The zoning ordinance directs this body to conduct public hearings for plan developments, map and text amendments to the zoning ordinance, and to make recommendations regarding long-term zoning and planning for the city. This commission will make a record and recommendation to send to the City Council, who is the determining body in these matters. Would you please call the roll?
Commissioner Halleck? Here. Commissioner Hugo?
Here.
Commissioner Johnson? Here. Commissioner Linwall? Commissioner Rogers?
Here.
Commissioner Westerberg?
So with 5 members present, we do have a quorum. I will note for the record that Chair Linwall is absent because she had to recuse herself on this matter like she did last year when this matter was initially heard. Also present tonight from the staff, our neighborhood and land use planner, Megan Jones, and our assistant city attorney, Alex Ruggie. This is a formal meeting and there are rules that govern our proceedings. Most importantly, only one person speaks at a time so that all testimony may be accurately recorded. Anyone who wishes to address the board regarding any matter on the agenda will have the opportunity to do so at the appropriate time. Commissioners may ask questions at any time. Our procedure is to hear from staff on the documents on file and then receive testimony and other evidence from the applicant. Next, persons who wish to make a statement regarding the matter may do so at that time. Any person with a legal interest in property located within, I believe it's 1,000 feet for tonight's particular case, of the subject property may present evidence, reasonably question witnesses, or seek a written continuance of the hearing with the intent to rebut testimony of the applicant. Public testimony is limited to 2 minutes per speaker under the Commission's rules. When all supporting and opposing testimony and statements have been heard, the applicant will be given the opportunity for rebuttal or a closing statement. Then the Commission will close the record and begin deliberations. No further questions or testimony will be received from the applicant or the public at that time. All testimony will be under oath. Although we do not apply the strict rules of evidence, please limit your testimony or statements to your personal knowledge. When you address the Commission, please make sure to state your name and address and sign in on the provided sheet. Our meetings are audio and video recorded. Please make sure you are at a microphone when asking questions or making statements so that you can be properly recorded. All proceedings are subject to broadcast at a later date. Any matter not concluded on tonight's hearing will be continued to our next regularly scheduled meeting. Tonight we have just one item on the agenda, and is the applicant for 1900 Sherman Avenue present? You don't have to come up yet. I'm just taking a quick check to make sure everybody's here. So with that, we will move into the first item on our agenda, which is the approval of meeting minutes for our August 11th, 2021 meeting. Has everyone had a chance to review?
Yeah, I've got 2 things.
Okay.
One is on page 4, this is a very small item, but on page 4, I was quoted as saying that in Chicago that with alderman approval, no parking could be required. It's actually for a TOD. So if you want to add that. Secondly, on page 6, staff was going to, I just wanted to ask about the status of this. The staff was going to provide information on similar developments to the one we reviewed about the impact of less parking. I just wondered if, I didn't want that to go falling through the cracks. And
There was a brief write-up that was included with the documents that went to Planning and Development Committee for that. If you would like, I can send that to the Commission
Could you?
for information.
Yeah, I mean, maybe all of us would like to see that. Okay, that's all I had, sorry.
Are there any other edits, changes? If not, is there a motion for approval of the August 11th minutes?
I'll move to approve.
Is there a second? It's been moved and seconded. Is there any further discussion? Hearing none, will you take the roll call, please?
Commissioner Halleck?
Yes.
Commissioner Hugo?
Yes.
Commissioner Johnson?
Yes.
Commissioner Rogers?
Yes.
Commissioner Westerberg?
Yes.
With that 5-0 vote, the minutes for August 11th, 2021 are approved. At this time, we will move into new business. The one item, as I mentioned, we have on the agenda tonight is 1900 Sherman Avenue. I'll read this into the record. So this is case 21 PLND 0076, a major adjustment to a planned development at 1900 Sherman Avenue. The Housing Authority of Cook County submits for a major adjustment to a planned development at 1900 Sherman Avenue, previously approved by Ordinance 109-020, to construct a 16-story residential building in the C1A Commercial Mixed-Use Zoning District. The applicant proposes changes to the following site development allowances. Number one, a decrease in the number of dwelling units from 168 to 152. Two, a decrease in the number of below-grade parking spaces from 37 to 25. And three, a decrease in zoning height from 172 feet 8 inches to 168 feet 4 inches. With that, I will ask anybody who feels they may be speaking on this issue to please be sworn in at this time by raising your right hand. Do you swear or affirm to tell the truth throughout the course of these proceedings? Thank you. And I would invite the applicant at this time for 1900 Sherman Avenue to please come up. Oh, I'm sorry. You've got a brief little presentations.
I got a quick overview, and then I'll pass the baton to you.
You're going to do the overview?
Yes.
Okay.
All right, so as Chair Rogers mentioned, we are here for a major adjustment to a planned development that was approved at 1900 Sherman Avenue. To briefly go over what was approved, this was approved in November of 2020 by Ordinance 109-0-20. The height was 16 stories at 172 feet 8 inches. There were 268 total units. This includes the existing units at Pearlman plus the 168 new units. This also included 34 on-site affordable units at 50% area median income and 17 units at 80 to 120% area median income. And this met the inclusionary housing ordinance, and there are no proposed changes to that item. There were 37 below-grade parking spaces that were proposed to replace the current 22 surface lot spaces on the south side of that building. There are existing spaces along the alley. There were 2 accessible spaces that would be added to those spaces. That was approved, and there are no changes to that. And also, as part of the approval, there were 5 site development allowances for building height, number of units, number of parking spaces, the number of loading berths, and the size of the loading berths. And the last 2 items relating to the berths are not going to be changed. So this evening, the request is for a major adjustment regarding the reduction in dwelling units from 268 total to 252. Again, the 34 on-site affordable units in the new building would be maintained. A reduction in the below-grade parking spaces from 37 to 25, and a reduction in the zoning height from 172 feet 8 inches to 168 feet 4 inches. It's still at 16 stories. And this is a summary of those proposed changes, showing what the base maximum is for the zoning district, what a site development allowance would be, what the approved project was allowed, and what is being requested this evening. And we can refer back to this as needed. So as part of approval of these major adjustments, the adjustments that are proposed to the development must maintain that development's satisfaction of the standards that are addressed in more detail in the staff report for this item. It's section 63510, standards for special use, 6369, standards for planned developments, and section 61019, standards and guidelines for planned developments in the C1A commercial district. And staff recommends that the Plan Commission make a recommendation for approval of the major adjustments to the planned development at 1900 Sherman Avenue to the City Council subject to the following conditions. One, that the required number of parking spaces to be leased within 1,000 feet of the property is increased to offset the loss in underground parking. And two, that the other previously approved conditions within ordinance 109-0-20 still apply to this development. And that is actually it for my presentation. I'll pull up the,
Can I ask one question at this point? So back to your staff recommendation, the recommendation regarding the condition for the required number of parking spaces to be leased, what is that number? Are we talking about the 12 that we're losing?
that is the initial proposal,
Okay.
the suggestion. Again, that is still up for discussion if the commission decides that there should be additional
I
spaces.
just want to understand the staff recommendation.
Mhm.
So we will make a brief presentation on these three major exceptions being requested. First, Richard Minacchio, the Executive Director of the Housing Authority, would like to make a brief statement to the Plan Commission.
Before you leave the vote, could you please state your name and address for the record?
William James, Principal Consultant with Camaros Limited. We are representing the Housing Authority.
Thank you.
Good evening, members of the commission. Good to see everybody again. I'm Richard Minacchio. I'm the director of the Housing Authority of Cook County. We appreciate your indulgence on these important matters. I just want to give my appreciation again for the commission's consideration of this very important development and especially the 51 affordable apartments that are going to be included. We think it's not just an architecturally significant structure, but also one that's going to provide much-needed affordable housing in Evanston. I'd also like to just acknowledge and thank her for coming. Our vice chairperson, Polly Keel, is with us today from the Housing Authority as well. Thank you.
Okay, and we have a brief presentation. Megan, you control the slides, correct?
I can, there should
Or-
be
Oh, this, okay.
something that can,
Okay, let's
Move
just
that
see if I can
forward.
operate this. Okay.
okay.
So this is our agenda. So these three major adjustments really come about as refinements to the design of the project. Frankly, they're very normal kinds of requests that come from going from a conceptual design, which is what is typically approved as part of a planned development, to a project that you can actually build. There are things that are discovered regarding site conditions that aren't discovered until you get into the design development process. There are certain refinements of the design that we're requesting, and we will go into that in detail, but we want to make sure that you understand that none of the public benefits that were approved in the original project are being compromised at all. And we will go over the specific nature of the request, why we're making the request, and why we think this commission should approve or recommend approval of those requests. So the need for the two amendments have come about regarding two discoveries. One was a structural issue with the foundation of the Perlman building that limits the proximity of the new building to that existing building. If we get too close to that existing building, we may undermine the structural stability of that building. So whereas the original approved building actually came up to and touched that existing Perlman building, we need to maintain a 10 to 12-foot separation between the new building and the existing Perlman building. So that has resulted in a need to change the underground parking configuration with the loss of parking spaces and the actual floor plate of the new building, because we have less area in which to spread the new building on. So that's one thing. And then the second issue is the COVID matter. So as we all know, COVID had changed our lives kind of permanently. They've changed what people want in terms of their apartments, in terms of the rental apartments. They favor larger units and less common area. shared space. They want more of their own space inside their own unit and less shared space because they want to keep social distancing and have the amenity in their unit. So those two discoveries have really driven the three major amendments that we will be talking about today. This material has already been covered by Megan, so we're going to go on to our first major adjustment. And how we're going to operate this is that project architect Greg Klazowski will speak to the need for the major amendment, and then I will talk about why it makes sense to approve it. Greg?
Thank you. I'm Greg Klosowski. I'm a senior associate with Papa George Sage Partners, the architect of record for the project. So this major amendment number one, this one is about the reduction in dwelling units, and the two diagrams on the right are showing exactly what Bill was talking about a few moments ago. The plan on the upper right, you can see the blue portion that comes up and touches the Perlman building that's shown in gray to the upper portion of the drawing or to the north. And then the lower plan shows that reduced floor plate where we're pulling that building back and creating that white gap or space between the two buildings. What we ended up doing to accommodate that was reduce the square footage, but then also reduce the unit count by 1 unit per floor. The amount that we reduced per each floor allowed us to spread out a little bit more of that square footage between all the existing units. So the 11 units are a little bit bigger than what they were previously when there was 12. What that also is impacting is moderately lower rates of traffic and parking that would be required within the building. So that's having impact on the neighborhood. Or I should say no impacts really. It's not increasing the parking impact. The load and the amount of people within the building would be less. And then as Bill was referring to with COVID, these slightly larger units are allowing us to meet these updated market preferences that we're seeing relative to rental housing.
Thanks, Greg. So why does this merit approval? Well, in all of these three requests, we think the consideration should be based on, are they reasonable requests? Are they needed? Do they increase any impacts on the neighborhood or surrounding properties? Or do they reduce the project's public benefits? So with respect to this first major amendment, it is a needed request. It's really a normal part of design development, and we discovered that issue with the Perlman building and the change in market preferences, so that makes it reasonable. This actually doesn't increase any impacts, actually it reduces impacts in terms of a whole range of things like traffic and frankly parking demand, mass of the building and so forth. And do they reduce public benefits? They do not. So we're maintaining the 34 affordable units that are actually at 50% AMI, which is a greater reduction in income than the inclusionary housing ordinance requires. We also have maintained the 17 what we call missing middle units will be income restricted to 80% of area median income. Not required by ordinance, but it's a part of this project that was approved and is a public benefit. So both of those are being maintained even though we're reducing the overall units by 16 units. So we'll go on to major amendment number 2. Greg, why do we need this?
This is speaking to the reduction in the building height, and this is really about what Bill was speaking to earlier. When we submitted the design as a part of the original PD, it was still in a fairly schematic stage. In this case, as we went through and started to develop the building, we were able to tighten things up, understand better what clearances we needed at different floors and at the roof, and in turn we were able to drop the building height slightly from where it was, from the 172.8 to the 168.4. So it was really a combination of the tightening up and frankly reducing a little bit of contingency that we like to put in just to make sure that we're going to be able to do what we tell people we can do. So the reduction of both of those allowed us to drop the height slightly.
It's somewhat ironic that we have to ask for this change. Your Evanston zoning ordinance is very strict in terms of what is a major change or major adjustment in the plan development versus a minor one, which can be handled administratively. So anything that's not defined as a minor adjustment automatically becomes a major adjustment, so this becomes a major adjustment. It's a normal part of the design, development, and refinement process. It reduces impacts. It's a slightly lower building. And it won't reduce any of the project's benefits. So I think that's really all we need to say about that one. And major amendment number 3 reduced on-site parking, and Greg will explain this in further detail, why we need it.
This one's a little bit more technical than the last one. What's really happening, what we're showing in the diagrams on the right, the one that's sort of in the middle or the left diagram, what you're seeing on the left-hand side, and it's a little bit hard to discern because of the projection here, but the line that's down the center was where the two buildings met. So the Perlman building is on the left, the proposed building is on the right. And we had an initial assumption, because the Perlman building is so tall, that it was built on caisson or some sort of pier foundation system, and that's what you're seeing coming down with the radiating pink triangle. That pink triangle is intended to represent the area of influence. In other words, the weight of the structure is coming down through those piers and then coming down underground at a 45-degree angle from each one of those piers. What you're also seeing sort of midway is grade. You're seeing 2 levels of parking below that. So we had assumed that those piers, which would be a reasonable assumption, would go down 60, 70 feet maybe. Even if it was only 50 feet, it would be well below a 2-level parking garage. And our parking design, as I'll show you in a minute, relied on that. What we actually discovered was that the Perlman building is actually on a mat slab foundation, which instead of a series of piers that it's resting on, it's a very, very thick chunk of concrete across the entire base of the building. And what that's doing is that area of influence that radiates out at a 45-degree angle isn't happening 40 or 50 or 60 feet below the ground. It's happening almost immediately below the surface. So as you can see on the right-hand side, that area of influence is cutting right through where we have our dual parking levels. And what that's really doing is it's making it incredibly complex and expensive to the point of not being feasible to hold back the weight, essentially the weight of that building with a wall of the garage. It becomes extremely, extremely difficult, if not impossible to do. And then also, as Bill was alluding to, it becomes potentially problematic for the building next door too. Of course, we wouldn't do anything that was unsafe to the point where the building would collapse, of course, but when you deal with something like that, you could start having cracks, you could start having some unexpected settlement. There are a lot of other issues that we wouldn't be able to anticipate until the construction happened. So in order to avoid all of those, we were looking at reconfiguring the garage. Yeah, there we go. What you're seeing in the plan here is actually the proposed reconfiguration of the garage. And if you can see how from the right to the left, it sort of stair steps down and away from the building to the north, that's us pulling the garage, the lower level of the garage away from the existing Perlman building. The slightly peach colored, I guess, portion that's in the upper middle, that's the ramp that's coming down, so that's still up a little bit higher, and then it comes around and down. The previous design actually came around and down underneath that ramp and back down again, and that's how we were able to get the number of parking spaces we previously had. But because we need to stay a significant distance away from that building to stay out of that zone, we had to pull everything back quite a ways, which only allowed us to do 25 parking spaces in this configuration.
And so why does this merit the commission's recommendation for approval? So I think when you look at what was approved, 168-unit new building with 37 parking spaces. We now have a 152-unit building, so we're reducing the units by 16, and we're reducing the parking spaces by only 12. And when we first approached the city with this project idea and talked about parking, they said that the other nearby developments that have provided on-site parking have all experienced a sharp reduction in demand from what was expected, and that they didn't think we needed to provide all the parking that was required by ordinance because of the experience of these other buildings. For example, the Link building right across the alley has 221 units. They have provided 161 on-site parking spaces. We just talked to them a couple days ago, and they only have 61 spaces that are being leased in the building by their residents. So that's a utilization rate of 27%. 7% of the units, occupied units in that building lease a parking space. So you can see that there's a lot of capacity in these other buildings to lease spaces. We're in discussions with the Link building. We have an informal understanding with them that they would be able to lease to us up to 80 spaces in their parking garage or their on-site parking. We will avail ourselves of that. We also have understanding with the E2 building, and we can lease an additional 50 spaces if we need them. No one knows exactly how many spaces will be needed. The Housing Authority has made a commitment to the existing residents of the Perlman building that every Perlman resident who has a car and needs parking will be provided free parking either on our site or in the Link building across the alley. So that's something that we want you to know first and foremost. There's obviously abundant existing parking in other buildings, other nearby buildings within 1,000 feet. We expect that every one of the new Emerson building residents who wants parking will be able to find parking with the assistance of the Housing Authority and these other property owners. So we really don't think that there is a parking issue here, even though we're losing 12 spaces by virtue of the reconfiguration of our underground parking garage. So that is, I think, the justification for approval on this one. And I believe that is all we really need to present. We're very willing to answer any questions that you may have on these three requests for major adjustment.
Commissioner Halleck?
I actually have a question for staff. Several projects that have come before us have, rightly so, I think, made the case that earlier projects that were approved have more parking than they need. And you're making the same case with the Link building, and we've been through all this. I just want, not to create more work for the staff, but I think as more projects come to us and use that same argument, it would be good to keep track of what these other, if an applicant is using parking in another facility, how much are they actually using? And then just sort of keep track of that, because, worst case, 10 applicants come to us and they all say the same thing. Well, they're not all going to park, use the same parking spaces. So I'm just suggesting that as a staff task.
No, that is noted, because we do have the TOD study that was done several years ago, and we've been looking at the number of planned developments that have come through. So we're aware, and there are a number of different things that we want to revisit and update. So
Okay.
that's
Yeah,
one of the
that
things.
was my only.
Commissioner Westerberg?
Just like to clarify, looking at the numbers here and make sure I have this correct. So you've gone from one building, Perlman, which had 116 units and 22 exterior spaces, to two buildings now that will have a total of 268 units.
Oh, one correction,
Sure,
the existing Perlman building has 100 units, not 116.
100. All right, good. It's good to know. And then you'll have 152 with your new proposal, so you'll have 252 units and 25 interior spaces that will serve both buildings, correct?
Underground.
Underground.
25 underground spaces.
Are there other exterior spaces?
There are other spaces along the alley. There are currently 16 spaces on the alley. We will reduce that to 14 in order to take the two handicap spaces that are in the existing surface lot and move them to the alley right by the rear entrance to the Perlman building.
So you would have 39 spaces in total?
Correct.
On-site?
Correct.
Just on-site, and that would need to serve both residents and visitors, families, friends, et cetera, correct?
Correct.
Okay.
Yes. One thing that I failed to mention is that this, as a senior building and with a substantial portion of affordable units, will probably have a lower rate of demand for parking than, say, the Link building would have, which were all active people. So just one thing to keep in mind.
Commissioner Johnson?
I just wanted to clarify, I'm sure I heard you correctly, what is the parking?
Yes.
The Lake building had 260-ish spaces?
A Housing Authority staff member has been working on an agreement with the Link building, and so she reported to me her conversations with the Link building. That's the basis of our data. I was told it has 161 on-site parking spaces. And that only 61, they have leases for only 61 of those spaces. And they have 221 units in the building. They have up to 80 spaces that they could lease to the housing authority. Correct. Way more parking than they need.
Commissioner Johnson, could you make sure your microphone is over? I don't think they're picking you up on the
Sorry about
video.
that. Is this better?
Yes.
Yes, okay. So the Link building has way more parking than they need, and the Link building is interested in leasing some of that parking to HACC should the residents need additional parking.
That is correct. The housing authority will enter into an agreement with the Link building for a certain number of spaces. Obviously, we don't want to reserve or pay for more spaces than we need for the new Emerson building, but we want to make sure we have access to all the spaces that we need.
Okay, thank you for repeating those numbers.
Just a clarification, excuse me, these are free parking spaces to the residents,
For the residents of the Perlman building,
not the residents of this building?
Not-
Or
not-
what about the affordable units? Do they pay
So,
for parking?
they would have to pay for parking. They're not existing residents who live in on site already. So if they move to the Emerson building, they would move into that situation with the parking configuration, the parking access as it is. So that would be a decision that they would make. My sense is that none of the affordable units would be occupied by people who need to lease parking space, because the parking spaces
Yeah.
are expensive. And I think that's one reason why the demand for the spaces is so low, is because the cost of constructing those spaces in a structure is high, and to cover the cost, the lease rates need to be fairly high as well. So I think affordable residents who move into the Emerson building will be those who don't need to have a parking space.
Yeah, I get the fact that the demand for parking is going down, and previously approved projects have probably too many parking spaces, and that's evident by the Link. But the argument that we get is that on other projects from residents is that if people don't want to pay for parking, so if there's a unit and the person has a car, they will park on the street. And I'm not addressing your specific site, but I'm just saying on all these other projects, this is the argument that we get, that the reason why there is demand for less parking on site is because people don't want to pay for it, and they're going to park on the street, and then the residents get upset, and et cetera, et cetera.
Well, I believe there's a stipulation in the approval of this project that says that the city will not allow residents of the Emerson building to apply for on-site parking permits, and that's something that we have agreed to.
One more question related to that. Have you done studies looking at other senior facilities to really get some hard data on truly how many seniors may not want parking, or how many now may want to hold on to their cars? Any kind of industry data that you've been able to look at?
Well, our parking and traffic consultant has looked at that, and he provided a recommendation on what he thought the parking demand would be for the total site, which frankly I think is overstated. His number was 101 spaces, which would be a demand ratio much higher than the Link building, for 152 units on 100 spaces, so it's about 3/4 of a space per dwelling unit, whereas the Link building utilization rate is 0.27 spaces per unit provided on the site. And given that we are going to be an elderly building, a senior building, and have a high proportion combined of affordable units, which would generate fewer cars, fewer parking demand, I think I think that 101 projection is frankly too high, but even if it were not, if it were on target, we would be able to lease the spaces we need from the Link building to cover that.
All right, the second part of the question is there a plan you can develop to share with the city that would make sure that if visitors or caregivers or whoever is coming to see people who are living at the new building, how do you encourage them and make sure that they will park in spaces that you may lease as opposed to parking on the street, which is what the neighborhood obviously is concerned about, and that can have a negative effect.
Right, and the Housing Authority has been looking into this and have been trying to assess the demand for those kinds of spaces, caregiver spaces and so forth. So, and I believe, Rich, you are going to make provisions for that in the parking facility, correct?
Yes, so when it comes to the caregivers, we are going to pay for that at the Link building. We'll figure out what the demand is, but we will make sure that that's covered. I mean, it's the right thing to do for the residents, but it also addresses, I think, the issue of on-street parking.
Thank you.
I just have a quick question for staff. So you said that the report that we had asked about last time had been produced, and without going into great detail, does the statement that lots of these places that are asking for parking are ending up with excess parking?
Short answer, yes, to varying degrees, based on probably where they're located. But generally, we have seen that there is less demand for parking spaces in the newer developments, especially if they're closer to transit options.
Okay. Thank you. Are there any other questions for the applicant at this time? Seeing none, I will ask you if you'd like to just take a seat for a moment. We will open it up for public testimony. A reminder to everyone that we do have a 2-minute time limit. I would ask you to confine your comments to the specific subjects that we're talking about here, because this is what we're asked to address. Any issues outside of the number of dwelling units, parking spaces, and height really are beyond our purview. This is an approved project. This is what they've come back to us and asked us to reevaluate. So I'll just ask everybody to keep that in mind when you're making comments. Do we have a list outside? There's a question.
Yeah, that. Right, this would be the time if we can alert you that if you have a continuance that you wish to submit a written continuance, this would be when you would be able to do that.
So is there, does someone have a written, yes, if you'd please come up and state your name for the record. Pardon me?
There may be more requests, but at least I have one. I'm Bruce Enenbach. I'm 723 Emerson, Evanston. I, along with residents of 719, 721, 723, 725, and 729 Emerson, 18 owners, residents in all easily within 1,000 feet of the subject project, have not received a public notice of a meeting as is required by those living within 1,000 feet of the subject project. Accordingly, I hereby request a continuance of the 1900 Sherman project for the following Plan Commission meeting, which I understand is October 27th. Additionally, now that I've seen the notice, it's disturbing that the new structural issue related to the mat slab foundation of the Perlman building was not even mentioned. I have concerns about the proposed solution. Nor was there any mention of what should be contemplated remediation of the soil, as was required for the Sherman Gardens parking lot likewise also adjacent to the previous lakeside cleaners and its known toxicity. Also, with the new 10 to 12-foot building separation of the two buildings, there is no longer a need for the C1A zoning designation. To quote the Plan Commission meeting minutes of 9/9/20, the primary reason for the request to change the zoning is that the planned development in residential district requires a 12-foot separation between the buildings, which cannot be altered via site development analysis. It should be noted that this new revised proposal, the buildings are separated. Additionally, there is no commercial use in this project. C1A zoning designation is inappropriate. Accordingly, this project needs to revert to R6, be governed accordingly by that designation, and be resubmitted. Lastly, it's inappropriate at this stage in the pandemic to not allow for remote participation. Many folks are still very uncomfortable with attending meetings such as this indoors. The last council meeting, appropriately, provided for both in-person and remote participation. This commission should do that as well. Accordingly, this meeting should be delayed at least to accommodate remote participation. That's my comment, and I have a written one for you.
All right, thank you. If you please, yes, if you please present that
Thank you.
to the chair. So, let me take care of this one first, and then I'll get to everyone else. That's fine, that's fine. So there's a couple different questions that have come up in this that I would like to talk to staff and legal about. So I'll just kind of run through them in the order that they are presented. So there is a claim by residents at 719, 721, 2325, 729 Emerson that are within 1,000 feet of the project that they did not receive public notice of a meeting. Were such notices sent to those particular buildings, do you know?
They were, well, per the code, we sent published notice within the Evanston Review. We mailed notices to property owners within 1,000 feet of the property, and then also posted on the property itself.
And does that meet the standards for public notice of a
That-
meeting?
That does meet the standards for the public notice.
And does legal agree with that statement?
Thank you, Chair. Alex Ruggie, Assistant City Attorney. Yes, I would agree that that met the legal notice requirements.
Okay. In moving through some of the other issues here, the issue with the mat slab foundation is something that I don't believe we have purview over at this particular time. Is that correct?
Not at this time.
There is a mention of remediation of soil, which is outside of the, again, the four corners of our document. I'm assuming that that was something, I don't know, I was not on the board at the time, but should have been raised last year during the discussion of the initial approval of this project by City Council. Along with the C1A zoning designation, that was approved by council. That's not something we are being asked to we aren't being asked to look at the zoning, underlying zoning of the property. And the issue of remote participation is something that I suppose we can talk about, not necessarily as a continuance matter on this, but as something that the city is determining when we can meet in public, when we do meet in public, when we meet remotely, things like that. So I did not specifically request that we meet in public. That was a decision that was made by the city. So I don't know that that's something that we really are here to address tonight. So before we take this, should I take the other continuance too, and we can just kind of handle all continuances together, so if there's duplicates of things, we can discuss that all at once. So yes, there was another person who had risen for a continuance. Yes,
The written copy first. Yes, can I paraphrase or no, read as is?
you can sort of paraphrase as long as I get the final one, and if you would just state your name and address for the record, please.
My name is Cecile McHugh. I live at 1926 Orrington, within 500 feet of 1900 Sherman. I am requesting a continuance to rebut the claim that the Emerson development meets the requirements of the inclusionary housing ordinance, rebut the calculation of maximum allowable units, the maximum allowable FAR, and the required number of parking places for the proposed development. Obtain the results of soil tests. I'm sorry, did the earlier speaker talk about soil testing?
He mentioned soil tests as well,
Would you like
yes.
me to skip that part then?
Um,
I can give the details. I would like to.
Yes, if you'd like to, that's fine.
The Emerson development is immediately adjacent to the Link Plan development. In the early stages of planning for the Link development, it was known that toxic waste from the operations of Lake City cleaners would need to be cleaned up before the Link could be built. Excuse me, is it okay to pull down my mask? Before the Link could be built upon the former site of Lake City cleaners, and the cost of the cleanup was factored into the financial plans, toxic waste from Lake City cleaners also needed to be cleaned up prior to construction of the Sherman Gardens parking lot, which is immediately adjacent. This cleanup was also a significant expenditure. Whether or not toxic waste is present on the site of the Emerson development must be determined in order to adequately plan for the protection of the health of the immediate neighbors, the Perlman residents, and to ensure the financial viability of the Emerson project. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. McHugh. If you just give me a hard copy so I can look through it. Thank you. If you have others that, yeah, we can pass them. Down HY. So again, kind of in looking at what we're being asked to review tonight and what is being asked in the continuance, the inclusionary housing ordinance is not something we are being asked to review tonight. In terms of calculation of maximum allowable units, allowable FAR, requested number of parking, of those items, the parking is the one that we are looking at this evening. And again, in terms of soil remediation, it's not an issue that is before us on this particular project. If you'd like to just make a brief comment, yes? If you just come up to the microphone, please, so you can be picked up for the record.
The comment about meeting the requirements of the inclusionary housing ordinance are relevant, I believe, because they affect the number of required parking places, in addition to the FAR, the maximum allowable FAR, and also the maximum allowable units.
Yeah, thank you. And I'll just respond to that by saying that the inclusionary housing ordinance was part of the last proposal, and that was part of the calculation for the parking spaces then. They've not changed their commitment, anything they're doing in terms of number of allowable units that are going to be affected by the IHO. Is there anybody else who has a continuance? There's another hand that went up.
Good evening. My name is Claire Wastel, and I'm a resident within 1,000 feet of 1900 Sherman. I request a continuance of tonight's meeting. I plan to rebut the adequacy and accessibility of parking, one of the major adjustments proposed tonight by the developer. Additionally, I would like to state that my partner was excluded from making a continuance this evening because she is a long-term renter in our community, and the city excludes her from this privilege.
Is that an accurate statement from, thank you. Is that an accurate statement? Renters are not allowed to make a statement for a continuance?
I would have to look into the rules and then I could get back to you.
Okay. I mean, I can see the logic for it on both sides, so I just want to make sure that that is the case. So it looks like, again, going into the statement here. Parking is one of the issues that we are being asked to address this evening. And then the issue about long-term renters versus owners being able to make continuances would be something that city staff should look into, and I'd be very interested to know how that comes out. So having heard the continuances, in my opinion, and I'll take opinions from other commissioners also, in my opinion, a number of the things that are being addressed here are things that are not within our purview for this evening's agenda. They are things that are already approved by City Council, or things that we're not being asked to look at. Obviously, changing zoning back is not something we're being asked to look at. If City Council feels that's something that should be done, City Council is more than welcome to make that referral back to us, but it's not something that we're undertaking on our own. It looks like the kind of common thread throughout the three that seems to be part of the request from the applicant involves the parking spaces. So I'll ask for other commissioners if they have thoughts, input, if they believe that I'm in error and we should be looking at other issues for continuances.
I will say this, Chair Rogers, when this project came before the Plan Commission last year, we were split. We did not approve it, we did not reject it, we were split in even votes. So in that sense, it did go to the City Council without a recommendation from the Plan Commission. Because of that, because there are some very good points about this project, but there were some valid concerns as well. I mean, I would be inclined to allow for a continuance to allow residents to make their statements as necessary on the parking issue. I'm also a little concerned about the rezoning point, which, as you say, is not in our purview, but it's an important point. So if we do not address it, I guess the question would be to make sure it is identified as an issue for City Council, and that's their privilege to deal with it.
And that's my thinking on a lot of these issues, is that this is really something that's handled at the City Council level, because they have much more latitude into how to address issues that we do not have as this body here. We are very kind of restricted into what is presented before us and making our recommendations based on those documents and not really going far afield into other areas. Other board members on the continuances?
I agree.
I just had a question
Yes.
about, aren't the rules of the Plan Commission that anybody can request a continuance and then they get the continuance and then we take it back up at the next meeting?
So this is where our rules get a little weird. Having come from ZBA, we granted continuances because we wanted to grant a continuance. No one necessarily had to request it. We felt maybe we didn't have the information, we would be able to just continue a matter, as well as having owners, nearby owners request continuances, or the applicant request continuances. The way that our rules are worded, and correct me if I'm wrong here, are that continuances are granted by the Plan Commission to rebut specific testimony that has been presented. And that's where it gets a little tricky, because continuances that are very open-ended just become delaying procedures. Whereas opposed to a specific continuance keeps things kind of focused in on, this is what we're coming back to talk about. It's supposed to be about rebutting specific testimony that has been presented by an applicant. Am I stating that correctly, Ms. Jones? She's nodding her head,
That is
yes.
correct, yes.
So that's where it gets a little tricky. We do have these continuances before us, and this is why I think we need to look at our rules. and change it, because there are other people here who want to speak, who may not want to speak on these particular issues of parking. And so granting a continuance specifically to address a rebuttal of parking presents an issue for the people who are coming to speak on issues other than parking. Legal, I will ask your opinion. So when a continuance is presented, must we act on it immediately, or can we take other testimony from other public members who may not be able to be here on the 27th or who have a different take, and then deal with the continuance?
Well, that's a great question, Chair. So I was looking at the rules, and Article 13G, Part G, discusses continuances, and it gives the requirements for a continuance, which would be that the person state their name and address to the commission and be presented in writing. And then it says if a request for continuance in proper form is received pursuant to the above provisions by a person who has disclosed his or her name and address to the commission, the meeting shall be continued to a date certain, and the continued hearing will begin with the taking of testimony by those requesting the continuance and proceed according to these procedures. So I guess it's not abundantly clear if immediately after the continuance is requested, if today's hearing ends based on that continuance. But I do believe the reading of the meeting shall be continued to a date certain means that because the request was made, it will be continued to a date certain.
We must grant the continuance.
Yes.
But is it an immediate
It does not
action
say.
that needs to be taken? And I guess that's what's unclear in the records, because I see some people here who I know are not here to speak about parking. And so I don't want to continue to address the issue of parking when we have people who want to speak to issues outside of parking.
Yes, and when the code is silent, I believe if the code intended it for it to be immediate, that would be written in the rules.
Okay.
I do believe the last time this came up was with the daycare center on the northwest Evanston area, and a continuance was requested to be able to provide a rebuttal to the parking information on that project. And we did do an immediate continuance on that, I believe.
How do you want to handle this?
So I'm looking back through the rules that we do have, and these would have been the ones that we most recently updated. It does say that in the event that a request for continuance has been submitted and approved, the commission may permit comments or testimony from individuals who know they will not be in attendance at the continued hearing. Should an individual comment at this time, they will not be permitted to provide comments at the continued hearing.
Okay, I think that clears it up for us. So I guess at this time, anybody who doesn't wish to speak to parking issues, which will be what we will continue for, is able to make public comment at this particular time. Are there individuals here who wish to speak to things other than the parking issue? I see a hand there. Mr., and let me get to your name here, Ennenbach? Yeah, if you'd like to come up. The one thing that I will caution you is that based on the rules that were just read, that this is your one time to speak, right?
Let me clarify, do you want anything, if I have anything say anything to say other than?
So if you want to speak about anything other than parking, now's the time to speak to it. But when you come back, you can only speak about parking.
Oh, that doesn't make any sense to me, but that's okay.
Well, like I said, the rules are a little weird, and
Yeah, I guess. They change every time. Okay,
So-
we'll go with that. To quote Mr. Minocchio, sorry, keep messing up your name. To quote Mr. Minocchio, no one anywhere, no public entity at least, is building this kind of a building, unquote. There are very good reasons for that, Mr. Minocchio. There is not a single developer in this city who would undertake such a project, as this is not a financially viable project. Pro forma is simply unreasonable. But you might say, hey, it's the county, And I would reply that while I may support money-losing projects for the county, which are in the interest of helping those in needs, I cannot support the county using my tax dollars going into a speculative market-rate residential building. There is not one private developer in the city that would put forth a project such as this. And the simple reason is that they would not be able to make any money on it. They would be unable to cover their costs of such projects. This is not an activity that we have signed up the county to do for us. This is not what we pay the county to do. The county performs numerous services for residences of this county, necessary and beneficial services for which I am very thankful. But developing speculative market-rate residential real estate is not one of them. The county is not an astute developer. They have no business trying to be. It's not their job, and our city should not facilitate it. I would ask that we please reject this project. With regards to structural standpoint, we have an existing building, the Perlman, sitting on a slab foundation, a mat slab, without the benefit of load-bearing piers or caissons, relying on the immediate ground for structural support. Now, I'm not a structural engineer, but the proposed mitigation of the Perlman's pad land requirement by moving the new building only 10 or 12 feet from the Perlman might appear to seem insufficient. The only way around this structural problem would be to provide sufficient structural shoring, read expensive, to the original Perlman building. As an example, some years ago, the rather elaborate and expensive shoring was required and performed to the adjacent condominium building to the south of the southern Mather building. Said condominium building would have fallen over had the remediation shoring not been performed. I do not think we want to have a Surfside, Florida incident here in Evanston. I am not satisfied with the proposed structural solution and would request a serious, thorough review by an experienced, qualified, and independent structural engineer. Thank you.
Thank you. Is there anyone else who would like to speak? Ms. McHugh?
I believe this is relevant to the number of units, which is under discussion tonight. You can see from the packet that the Emerson will be on the southernmost section of the lot, pushed almost to the edge, and the Perlman is on the remaining northernmost section, with now 12 feet between the two buildings. I've calculated the FAR for the Emerson relative to its section of land to be approximately 8.5, and the FAR for the Perlman relative to its section of the lot to be approximately 1.9. If the Perlman building had not yet been built, and HAC was proposing building these two buildings at the same time, is this a design you would approve? If not, don't you think that that is grounds for not approving the Emerson as a supposed addition to the Perlman development? Please use this opportunity to stop this development, calling upon HACC to propose a reasonable development, truly in addition to the Perlman, perhaps closer to the original design. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Kelly, you are not allowed to speak at this particular hearing under your own council rules. So you can address your issues then. There are specific guidance as to how a council member is allowed to speak. They can speak to map and text amendments. They can speak if they are an applicant, but they cannot speak at a hearing in which they do not meet those standards, and that's under city council rules. Was there anyone else who wanted to make a statement? Yes, sir. Yeah, I mean, it can be a comment, a request, a question, anything. So if you just state your name and address for the record, please.
Yeah, my name is Steve Morrison. I live at 1935 Sherman, within 1,000 feet. And I just have a couple questions for Mr. James. I'm sure you mentioned this, but as a point of clarification, the number of affordable units in the reconfigured development has not changed. Okay. In the resizing of the existing units, have you changed the configuration of studio, 1 or 2 bedrooms, or has that proportion stayed the same and just the square footage for units has changed?
Mr. James, I'm going to ask you to come up so that you can be picked up by the microphone, just for the record. Thank you.
Well, I'm going to ask our architect to come up and say if the proportion of the different units has changed or just the size. Greg, can you answer that question?
I would need to double check. I believe with the reduction of the 2 units that were going to the north are a little bit smaller, and, but I don't recall if there was a change from like a 1-bedroom to a studio. There was 1 unit that was eliminated, but I don't recall if it was a 1-bedroom or a studio. So that reduction, 1 per floor, so that does change the mix, but I believe it's only the reduction of that 1 unit that was eliminated.
I asked that question because I know that some of the unit configurations are available as affordable units and some of the configurations are not available as affordable units. Is that correct? Correct. Okay. And then the final question regarding you mentioned the change in market post-COVID. I was wondering, is there any specific data you could point to or share about where you got that information?
I personally cannot speak to that. It is information that was brought to us by the applicant and the applicant's private sector partner, a firm named Related Midwest, who does a lot of development in the multifamily sector and are frankly very in tune to the latest trends in that. And so their expertise was brought into the reconfiguration of the units. So the reconfiguration of the units is a product of separating the 2 buildings and having less overall floor area to work with, and a desire to increase the size of the units to respond to post-COVID preferences. And again, I would just cite Related Midwest as the authority on that particular question.
Great. Thank you all very much. Thank you.
Thank you. Was there anyone else who wished to speak to the commission tonight?
I actually received an email
Okay.
a short time ago after the meeting started from Kira Kelly, who was unable to attend the meeting today. And I forwarded that to commissioners if you are able to.
Is it a fairly short?
It's a fairly lengthy email.
Okay.
It does address, I think, some of the previous comments that were brought up regarding the rezoning and if there's ability to revert the zoning back. She also brought up that half the commissioners were not in favor of the initial project and the rezoning last year. She expressed issues with the precedent for this type of development. She expressed concerns with developers' rationales for stepping outside of the zoning requirements that are within the code. And also that with the precedent that has been set with the nearby building, this seems to be continuing with the Emerson's proposed changes. And also, she mentioned that the traffic on Emerson is untenable as it already is, and waiting 2 to 3 times through a traffic light when traveling west. And she believes that the analysis that shows otherwise is a falsehood. She also mentions that the rental rates are higher than they should be and are basically more luxury units in this particular type of building when there should be more for affordable housing.
Thank you.
She also urges the commission to deny the requests.
So I received that. I'm assuming everyone else probably has as well.
Yeah, I will also include this in the addendum of comments that I include in future packets that go out, so.
Okay. Seeing no other testimony, now we have the continuances, so I will ask for a motion from one of the commissioners to continue the matter 21 PLND 0076 to our regularly scheduled meeting on the 27th of October 2000, 2021.
What new information are we going to get?
So we'll be discussing parking.
We've already discussed parking.
So they have requested a chance to rebut the testimony of parking.
But they're questioning the calculation of the inclusionary ordinance, right?
That's not something we're talking about. We're looking only at the reduction in parking. Is the only matter that's been applied for by the applicant that is in the continuance requests. So we will allow them to rebut in whatever way they choose the fact that a reduction from 37 to 25 will have an impact on the neighborhood, which the applicant says it will not, and they will take steps to make sure that it doesn't.
Just want to make note. The interesting thing is that most of the parking requirement is not in this building. It's going to be in the adjacent building, where they have a floating number of parking spaces that they could acquire. I'm sorry, I just don't understand.
Like I said, because of the way our rules are written, we must grant a continuance if they want to rebut that information. So that's why I am asking for a motion to continue so that a rebuttal of parking spaces, a parking space reduction will have an impact on the neighborhood.
I'll move to provide for a continuance.
So it's been moved by Commissioner Westerberg. Is there a second?
Second.
Commissioner Johnson seconds. I will ask for a roll call vote from Ms. Jones.
Commissioner Halleck? Commissioner Hugo?
Can we vote no, or is it automatic that the continuance has to happen? In which
I
case the
mean,
vote is pro forma.
This is,
The rules do say that a continuance shall be granted, so it's pretty certain.
With objection, yes.
Commissioner Johnson?
Yes, I'm voting for the continuance because we have to have a continuance, so yes.
Commissioner Rogers?
yes.
Commissioner Westerberg?
Yes.
So I believe that's a vote of 4-1. So-
Yes.
So the continuance will, has been approved, which means we will address the issues regarding the parking, and the applicants who submitted a continuance request will be able to rebut the documentation and testimony of the applicant in regard to parking.
Yeah, and for clarification, that'll be at the next regularly scheduled Plan Commission meeting for October 27th.
That's 2 weeks from tonight.
Yes.
Yes. That is something that I don't know that I get to decide. That's something that staff gets to decide. So I think we can make a request that we allow for a remote participation. We will be here.
Yes, the meetings can be conducted in a hybrid model, so the Plan Commission can choose to do it that way.
So is that our decision to make?
Yes.
So I will ask if there's a motion to conduct a hybrid meeting for the 27th.
I move.
Is there a second?
Second.
Westerberg moves, Hugo seconds. Would you please call the roll?
Commissioner Halleck? Commissioner Hugo?
Yes.
Commissioner Johnson?
No.
Commissioner Rogers?
Yes.
Commissioner Westerberg?
Yes.
The vote of 4-1, the motion passes. So we will conduct a hybrid meeting for our next meeting, which means you will be able to participate remotely as well as in person. Yes, Ms. Kelly, is there a question? Yes.
Can you explain who is it that decides what's in your purview? So for example, the structural concerns, I mean, obviously, these major adjustments, without these, this building wouldn't be built at all. So there's a lot involved with these. And so, many items were discarded as not being within your purview. You said, we are not being asked. When you said, who is not asking you? I just wanted
So
some
when we get the
clarification.
application, we have, the staff says these are the things they're requesting a change
So
on.
staff has told you what you're allowed to
So
talk about?
the staff memo is outlining what we are to review.
Right, but if you look at like these major adjustments, you should really all decide what's within your purview, given the adjustments. You are the experts that we've appointed to this committee. I would think that your purview, you should decide.
But no, it really comes down to what staff presents for us to decide. That is in the same way that a judge,
Okay.
when they're presented with something, is allowed to rule on the briefs, the documents that they are presented.
Yeah, there are certain things that by code are under the purview of the Plan Commission. And over time, legal has directed us to tell Plan Commission that there are certain things that can or cannot be reviewed or talked about, so to speak, by the Plan Commission. I think one of those was public benefits. They're not to get too far into the weeds on those and items of that nature. If there's something that the commission feels would provide additional information on things that are listed under their purview, then I believe that would be fine. And
And if I can just add, the commission is restricted to the application from the applicant. So staff isn't deciding what is in your purview, it's part of the application. So your purview is pursuant to the application being given, so you can't go outside of the application because this project has already been approved.
Right, but if we're talking about structure and we're talking about a new foundation, certainly that would be within your purview. And I don't know who told you you couldn't discuss that. Or, for example, toxicity. I mean, we're talking about the ground again. This is a building that wouldn't be built without this major adjustment. So just about everything is coming into, I would think would be, I mean, you should, at least, it seems to me that at least it's debatable whether it's within your purview or not to discuss, for example, toxicity of the soil, which is something that I'm still waiting for those studies, or structural questions.
Say, I don't think either of those issues would ever be in our purview. We have never discussed the structure of the building and whether it's adequate. Never. We have never discussed the soil conditions, ever. I think those are building permit issues. They will come up in the building permit review process. There are reviewers who review the structural analysis. There are people that review the soils reports. That's not what we do.
We do review zoning, though.
We do?
We do.
Yes.
Right? So if there is a zoning change which is triggered by something now that has changed, you could argue that is something that we at least have a right or have a responsibility to question. And if only to question it, at least to put it in front of the city council. This is a strange situation because this is a project that's already been approved by the city. So that's one of the reasons why our ability to comment is somewhat limited. We can look at the changes that the applicant has proposed, and one of those changes is to separate the two buildings. And because that triggers an issue, it seems to me it is our responsibility to at least look at that. And if I'm in error, please, legal, let me know, and we'll proceed accordingly.
Well, maybe that's a question. Does that separation trigger the zoning issue or not?
I think at this time that'll be an issue that legal has to look into and get back to you at the next meeting.
May I make a
Just
comment and ask a question?
Just a brief statement. Yes, Mr. James.
Okay. In terms of a comment, I think a lot of the public comments that have been allowed to be brought into the record are off-topic. There are only 3 topics, only 3 matters to be decided by this committee. One is, should you allow the reduction of units from 168 to 152? Is that something you want to recommend be allowed? Do you want to recommend the reduction in building height by about 4 feet, a little over 4 feet? Is that something you want to allow, or you want to prohibit the applicant from making that change? And the third is whether you would recommend that the applicant be allowed to reduce the number of on-site parking spaces by 12 spaces, given the reduction of units by 16 and other factors. So those are the only 3 matters under consideration, and yet we've heard comments talking about toxicity. We've heard comments talking about changing the zoning from C1A to R6. That is not under consideration here, and it is an attempt to revisit the original approval, which really cannot be done. And my question is, will the public comment at the next meeting be restricted to matters of
Parking.
parking, technically?
That is the
that is the
issue,
only
that is the issue
topic
that has
that will
been
be-
continued so that there can be a discussion
And
on
that
parking.
public comments would be restricted to parking?
That is the way our rules work. That's the way it should be.
Okay, I just want to clarify that. All
And
right.
I am assuming that I will be chairing again because Chair Lindwall will have to recuse herself for that. I don't know if we have another agenda item, but for at least this portion of the meeting.
All right. Thank you.
Yes, one more comment, and then we're going to wrap up since we technically have continued.
There's one other very major change. This building is not the same building. Structurally, it's not the same building.
Okay,
They should have to start over. It's not even the same zoning anymore. This needs to start over, period.
all right, thank you. With that, do we have any other things to discuss tonight?
That is it for business for this evening.
Okay. So that is, having conducted our business, we've continued the one matter. Is there a motion to adjourn? Johnson moves, Halleck seconds. Will you take do you have to take a roll call vote for adjournment?
No.
Okay, there is no. So all in favor, please say aye. Aye. Opposed? With 5-0, we stand adjourned until our meeting on October 27th here in City Council chambers, which will be a hybrid meeting. Thank you.